You see this with the way wings are designed in an airplane. The form of that is set up for the function of lift. You see it in nature. An anteater's nose form follows the function of having to get deep inside an anthill and get its food. So form follows function is this principle we're setting up this first half of our time here together. So when you think about it, when you are writing for a legislative audience, and that could be members, it could be other staff, it could be constituents, other government agencies, when you are doing that, what is your function? Well, I'm going to argue that your function is to educate. So you are in the teaching business, even though you're only a legislative staffer and you didn't think you signed up to be a teacher, you are, because you have detailed information that the audience of your writing does not have. And so you have to make sure that the form on the page is correct to achieve that function. You are trying to get this detailed knowledge that you understand into their brain, stuck in their brain, and processable in their brain. So that is your function, to educate. You are in the teaching business when you write. Before we get started here, I want you to think right now about some of the typical writing products that you create. Certainly email is on that list, and depending on what your job is, you might do newsletters, or you might do policy briefs, or you might do constituent communication. So start to think about the types of things you typically write, so that as we talk about these principles today, you can go, hey, I could use that piece here, or maybe that piece would work here. So we're going to talk about this form on the page to achieve that function of educating your audience. But before we get into that, I want you to actually do some writing. It is a writing workshop, so I'm going to ask you to do some writing. It looks like everybody's got a little piece of paper here in front of you. I'm going to give you 4 minutes to do this. What 3 attributes or skills are most essential for someone to do your particular job? And don't sit here and agonize about what are the top 3. It's not about what you choose as the 3. You can literally pick any 3 skills you want, but I want you to write an answer to this. And I'm not going to give you any instruction of what that writing should look like, because I want you to just do it the natural way that you would write this answer to this prompt. So I'm going to give you 4 minutes starting now. And this is the awkward part of the video for those of you onboarding right now. You should probably, I'm going to talk to the camera now. You should do this at home. If you are a new staff member here at the Ohio House, you should take these 4 minutes and do the same thing, because the principles I'll talk about later, we're going to come back and refer to your writing too. So not just the people in the room, but the people watching in 2027, perhaps. I don't know when somebody might be watching this. So take a little time, write this out in whatever natural way you might put this on the page, and then we'll come back and see if that natural way actually dovetails nicely with some of the principles we're going to talk about today, or maybe needs to be adjusted based on some of the principles we talk about today. We're going to refer back to this about 5 times. And again, don't freak out about which 3. So about 3 minutes left. I guess this is an interesting thought experiment too. What are the 3 skills or attributes that are most essential to your job? Have you really stopped and thought about that? Probably you haven't. Most people don't. It's a wonderful opportunity for you to reflect a little bit on your career and on your job. I should have played Jeopardy music or something soothing right now for this interlude. About 2 more minutes. Kind of explain why those things are important a little bit of analysis there. Don't just list 3 things on a page. Kind of explain the why. And we got about 1.5 minutes left, so you should be kind of pacing yourself here. Try to make sure you get all 3 of those things down and explained. And 1 minute left. Thirty more seconds. Just out of curiosity, while these people are finishing up the last 30 seconds, what's one of your attributes?
I say relatable.
Oh, okay. Being relatable to members and other constituents? Okay. What's one of yours?
Organizational habits.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Somebody over here. What's one of yours?
I'll say dependability.
Oh, okay. All right. Excellent. All right. Very good answers, everyone. You're not being graded on your answers, but good answers. All right. Looks like everybody is done. So we're going to look at that writing and see if its form on the page really fits with some of these principles I'm going to talk about here today. Before we get into that form, what is the right form to achieve that function? Let's talk about your audience first. Let's understand why these things I'm going to talk about today matter so much, because your audience is a particularly difficult audience to reach with writing. They're not PhD students. They're not people that necessarily like to read long books. In fact, they're extremely busy folks, right? Whether it's members, whether it's other staff, whether it's constituents, they are racing around through life just like you are. And this, by the way, is your report. That's your newsletter. That's your thing. And so you got to remember, they're not going to have a lot of time to get to that thing. It's going to be difficult for them to get to it. They're very busy. They're also doing this. And this is an important point for one of the principles we're going to talk about here today. We all know that you can't multitask, right? You all understand the neuroscience is clear about that. We can't do two things with our brain at once. What we do is we task switch. So if I'm reading your document that you wrote and my phone chimes and I check it, I task switch away from your writing, and then I have to task switch back to your writing. And if I'm back to your writing and then my email pops up and I stop and I respond, then I have to task switch back to the writing. So there's this constant reconnection with the writing that's going to be very important, and we'll talk about here in a minute. And then maybe the worst barrier to interacting with this audience is this. They don't like to read. They're not that different than most human beings in that we don't like to read, particularly we don't like to read stuff we don't really want to read. So here's a stat for you, might shock you. Last year in America, only 20%, 1 in 5 Americans read a book last year. So they're not big readers. And when they do read, they're not particularly good at it. On the National Assessment of Adult Literacy, so this is a test that adults take on reading, 43% of Americans scored in the bottom two categories, basic and below basic. So what's the point of all this? The point of all this is when your document, when your email, when your newsletter, when your policy brief shows up in their world, they don't go, hold my calls, and they don't shut their phone off and close their computer down and close the door and brew up a cup of tea and sit cross-legged and just dig into it. They don't do that at all. They're barely connected to it, so you have to make sure that the form on the page is able to connect with this busy, often task-switching, reluctant reading audience. So what does that look like? What are some of these techniques that we can use to connect with that type of a reader, that type of an audience? So since I started with an architectural principle, this idea of form follows function, we're going to continue with an architectural metaphor here and talk about sort of the entryway to the house, the foyer, if you will, and this concept of bluff, bottom line up front. Most of those readers who are busy and task switching and reluctant readers, many of them only want to walk into the front door, grab the package in the foyer, and leave. They just want to get the thing they want out of your writing. They don't want to have to tour the whole house. So you need to give them this opportunity to just get the bottom line right away and leave the document. Now, some of them might linger. Some of them might want to walk through the whole house. Some of them might want to read all your analysis. Some of them might want to read the whole thing. But many of them just want to get in and get out. So where are ways in which we can practice this idea of bluff? I'm going to talk about it about 5 times today, but here's a few. One, have an executive summary. Maybe it's a 5-page report, but the first paragraph summarizes what the whole report says. And most of those readers will say, okay, that's all I needed to know. If I have more time or I have more interest in that topic, I might invest time in the 5 pages, but if I don't, I'm just going to read that executive summary. We can do it in a paragraph. Maybe I want all the analysis, maybe I want all the details, maybe I want all the stats, but if my topic sentence tells them what the paragraph says, that's all they really have to read if that's all they want to read. I can do it in an email. Maybe it's a long email that might require some scrolling down the page, but I'm going to give them the bottom line up front right at the beginning, so that if that's all they want, they can close that email and move on to another thing in that stack that I showed you later. Or we can do it in a newsletter. I'm going to argue that this is almost bottom line up front. So we're going to take a little pop quiz right now. We're going to see who is the leading candidate for valedictorian of today's class. Somebody tell me what you would change to make this better bluff. What would you move up to the top that is the true bottom line of this entire document? That every other thing in the document simply supports that claim. What is the bottom line? Yes, ma'am?
I'd put the priorities at the top.
You'd put the priorities at the top? Okay, that's one theory. What's another thing that you might move to the top? Yes, ma'am?
The city's moving in the right direction.
That's what I would say. I understand your point, but I'd say that's the big thesis here, right? And every other thing is just an example of that, and then kind of looking forward, what do we want to do to keep moving in that direction? So this is almost bottom line up front. And again, somebody reading this goes, city's moving in the right direction. That's all I want to know. Okay, we're good to go. I feel relaxed now and happy. I'm not reading anymore. Other person, detail-oriented person, might read every single word on this page. But remember, you are dealing with busy, distracted, reluctant readers, and very often that's all they want is that bottom line up front. So go back to your writing, the little thing you just did. Did you, I'm going to ask you a question, raise your hand, if your first line names all three attributes? Who previewed all three attributes in your first line? Okay, nicely done. This side of the room. This side of the room, I'm going to guess you did one attribute and explained it, then another attribute and explained it, another attribute and explained it. So the problem with that is the busy reader who just wants bluff, who just wants to come in the entryway and leave, they got it over here. They read the first line. Those are the three attributes. I don't really care what the reasons are. That's all I need to know. Over here, I have to read one. I have to read two. I have to read three. And if I get a call or somebody walks in my office or my phone chimes or my email dings, I might never get to the second one. I might never get to the third one. So bottom line up front was a little test of your writing thing today. Think about previewing information always at the beginning of any written document that you are creating. Okay, so that's the entryway. Then I'm going to keep going with the architectural metaphor here and talk about sort of the layout of the house, the floor plan of the house. You know, there's like a ranch house that's all in one story, or you might be in a townhome that has multiple stories. So we're going to think about the layout of that, and in writing terms, that's what we call organization and structure. And what's interesting about organization and structure is that the brain wants to receive information in a particular manner. It's primed because of its experiences in life to want information given to it in an organized and recognizable structure. And when you think about writing for a legislative audience, there's really about 4 structures or organizational systems that really work for that audience. And I'm not going to spend all day talking about them, but I am just going to share them with you. One of them is sequencing. Very obvious kind of structure. Let's say you're talking about how to do a recipe. Well, that's the first thing I need to do, and then there's the second thing I need to do, and there's the third thing I need to do, and now I've got a cake, right? There's a sequencing, and the brain wants to see information in an organized way. Second is causal, a cause and effect structure. And this is great for the political realm because maybe there's a cause out there, homelessness, let's say. And what are some of the effects of homelessness? Well, maybe it's crime, maybe it's encampments, maybe it's drug and alcohol abuse. We see that kind of causal relationship a lot in legislative writing. The next is classic compare and contrast. Let's say there's 2 proposals out there to solve homelessness. And you are now educating your constituents through, I don't know, some document that you're going to send out to your constituents saying, well, this is one approach and here's another approach. And I'm comparing the things that are similar about them and I'm contrasting the things that are different about them. Maybe my member that I work for has an approach that I think is better, and I'm going to try and show that that's better through this process. And lastly, and this is the most classic legislative one of all, problem and solution. If you're a high school debater, you did this all the time. Problem and solution. We had a problem, homelessness. Well, What is the policy that is being proposed in the House here in Ohio to solve that problem? What, will it solve? What is that problem and solution? So the point I'm making here is that the brain of your reader is already pre-wired to accept information in one of these four structures. So you should think before you even start typing on the keyboard, you should think about what is the right structure for the thing I'm trying to get out. What's the bottom line? I want to put that first. And then what's the right organizational structure that a brain will really be able to soak this material in? Remember, you're in the teaching business. You're trying to do the thing a good teacher would do to make that audience understand that thing. So of these four, which of the four did you probably use on your written document today? Well, you didn't do problem and solution, and you didn't do compare and contrast. So you could have said my job compared to another job. Cause and effect, nope. What'd you probably use? Sequencing. This is the most important attribute, that's the second most important attribute, and that's the third most important attribute. By the way, with the principle of bluff, where should your top skill or attribute be? First, second, or third? The number one, the thing you think is the most important, should go where? First. It's bottom line up front. Maybe the person only reads that part, and then they stop reading. At least they got the number one attribute. So organization and structure is enormously important. Okay. So we've got the entryway. We got this concept of like bottom line up front. Let's give them what they need if they want to leave. We're going to put it in a structure that works for them. The floor plan's going to work. Now we're going to continue with our architectural metaphor and say, okay, now we got a floor plan. How are the rooms divided up? Is it a loft with an open concept floor plan, or is it an old house that has a bunch of tiny rooms? And what we're talking about is this concept of chunking. Chunking text. It's a really interesting concept, and it doesn't change the words you've written in any way, and it doesn't change your organizational structure in any way, but it changes the experience that the reader has with your text. Here's why you have to chunk, because of this effect: primacy and recency. What it says is the audience will retain information that they experience at the beginning of your writing, and they will retain information that they experience at the end of your writing. What you don't want to do is linger for a long time in what I call the trough of death. That's where readers go to die. That's when they take your document and set it aside. I'm going to talk about two things that kill readers. The number two killer of readers is density of words on the page. It freaks them out and intimidates them. If they're a reluctant reader or not a good reader, they just don't want to engage with density of words on the page. You tell me, by the way, I'm going to show you an example of actual legislative writing as it was produced and published. Is that encouraging to you? Does that make you want to just cozy up to that text? Or is that a very long trough of death right there? It's a very long trough of death. So what's interesting is all you have to do is take that same paragraph and chunk it. Over here you have one opportunity of primacy and one opportunity of recency in a long trough of death. If I simply chunk that text out, I now have primacy, recency, primacy, recency, primacy, 10 different opportunities to connect with the reader instead of 2 different opportunities to connect with the reader. And don't just take it from Kurt from NCSL, former English teacher, take it from people who study this academically. When we chunk text, we get some really wonderful, valuable results. What happens? It improves the comprehension. That's what you want. You want them to understand. You want them to retain, right? We see this comprehension improve significantly when it's chunked into smaller pieces. And the reason for this is that reluctant reader or not very good reader gets freaked out by stuff like this. And they either can't work their way through it, they don't have the resilience to work their way through it, or they just frankly set it aside. So when we chunk it, we get amazing results out of that. So how many chunks? How many chunks on the page? Kurt says we should have a lot of chunks. Should I have 50 chunks? No, about a rule of 4. The metaphor of the file cabinet there can help you sort of get that feeling. If that one doesn't work for you, if that metaphor doesn't stick in your brain, maybe this one will. Has absolutely nothing to do with writing, but it is a rule of 4, and hopefully that will stick in your head. I'll give you an example of this from an actual document produced, and you notice, perfectly done, right? 4 chunks. And this also has a couple other elements that we're going to talk about here in just a second. So chunking is a really weird idea. But it's about the form on the page, right? The form follows the function. We are trying to connect with that reader, and if we put trough of death, long text, all together, we freak people out. It also makes it hard to navigate around and find what we want, which we're going to talk about just in a second. One last thing about chunking. One idea in each chunk. My dad used to use the expression, it's 10 pounds of sand in a 5-pound bag. If you try to put multiple ideas in one chunk, you throw the reader off. They only want to consume sort of one nutritional element per chunk. So think about how you divide up text and think about where those break points are. So in your writing, let's go back to it. How many of you wrote one long paragraph? Hands up if you wrote one long paragraph. Okay, a couple of you. I don't know, you're shy. Like, I know he's going to say that's bad, so I'm going to just barely put my hand up. How many of you wrote 3 different paragraphs? Okay, so you guys automatically chunked. You already had the instinct to chunk that out. If you wrote one long paragraph, think about how that changes the experience of the reader. Simply by changing it into 3 paragraphs, you change their experience because it doesn't look so dense on the page. They don't freak out, and their comprehension goes up when they encounter that work. Okay. So we've talked about the entryway. We've talked about the organizational layout. We've talked about how we chunk the rooms up. But what happens if there's a reader who just wants one chunk? They're looking for just one little piece of information in the house. They just want to go to the master bedroom, or they just want to go to the kitchen, or they just want to go to the bathroom. They don't want to have to walk through every single room in the house. How do we allow them to navigate to the piece they want, to the idea they want, to the chunk that they want, fast, efficiently, quickly, so they get the information that they want and they can just get out of the document itself? The way we do that is using clear and specific headers for our chunks. The headers tell them they're in the kitchen. The headers tell them they're in the living room. The headers tell them they're in the family room. These are not very good headers right here. I'm going to criticize these headers, except for to say this. You probably didn't expect to learn this in a writing workshop today, but when I plucked this thing off the internet to show you headers, I didn't know that there was a vegetable called a tuber. Did anyone else know there's a vegetable called a tuber? So you've at least learned something valuable today. Next time you're having a salad at a friend's house, you'll be like, these tubers are awesome. Now, here's why I don't like these. These are just labels of what those chunks are about. But they don't give the reader any information other than the label. And remember who we're talking about. Busy, task-switching, reluctant readers. They want to just skim and scan, find the room they want to go in, get that information, and get out. So let's think about 2 better ways to head our chunks that give them some information, and one of them actually gives them an incentive to read more. Here are the 2 methods. Either make your header a question. And so the beauty of that is, as they're skimming and scanning, they see that question as the header, and they go, oh, okay, that's the question. Guess where the answer is? It's in that chunk, right? I now know that the answer is in that chunk. You have given them a reason. You've given them an incentive to read that chunk because the answer is in the chunk. That's for somebody who you expect will actually sit with the text and read it a little bit. But if you've got a person that you know is even busier, even more task switching, even more reluctant as a reader, just state the conclusion of the chunk of the passage as the header. So they can just read the header and go, good, I don't even need to read that. I got the information. It's another example of that bottom line up front, right? So here's some examples. What's the legal standard for determining cannabis DUI? Let's say it's a legislator here and you're thinking about a cannabis legalization bill, and they want to know, well, how do we determine if a person's under the influence on the highway? They know the answer is going to be in that chunk. They now have a reason to read that chunk. That's where the answer lies. But the super busy person who does not want to read very much, but they're doing some research on, what's the reason most people die in car crashes? Well, it's not putting on their makeup. It's not shaving. It's not being on the phone. It's not eating hamburgers. It's not wearing seatbelts. You've given them, so in that chunk you might have data about that. You might have reasons, explanations, analysis. They don't want that. They just want to know the answer. And the answer is the header. Here's 2 other, and you can be a little bit fun with your headers a little bit. I think these have a little bit of literary quality to them. Will rainy day funds be enough to weather the storm? The next time COVID hits or some bad thing happens, a tornado comes through, do we have enough money to deal with that? Well, guess what? I have to read the chunk in order to get that answer. But for the super busy person that doesn't want to read the chunk at all, just tell them. We have enough money right now. We were set for the pandemic. Find the way to let them navigate to the room they want and only want, and then let them get that information and get out of there as soon as possible. Now, I'm not going to ask you to go back and put a header on each of your 3 chunks for those of you that wrote 3 different paragraphs, but think, what would the right question be for that first attribute? What would a statement be that sort of sums up the second paragraph? Think about how you would have headed each of these chunks had you have written in that way. So I'm going to wrap up this kind of opening overview by sort of saying all these things work together. The idea is form follows the function. The function is to teach. The function is to get information that you understand into their brain in a way that they can understand. So the way you set it up on the page is the way that's going to happen for this particular audience. And they all work together. Figure out what the bottom line is and put that in the front. And then figure out what the right organizational structure is for that particular document, and then make sure that you chunk that document out so that you don't freak them out with the density, and then make sure that you head each of those chunks in such a way that you give them that navigation tool to find exactly what they want. I will tell you, I talk to members all the time, and I talk to staff a lot too. Not so much constituents, although every once in a while I might be in an interaction with constituents. And I'll tell you, almost all of them, when we talk about documents that they get, and this is maybe a secret, but I'm revealing it now, they don't read everything. They just don't. They can't. They're bombarded with stuff. They're looking for quick, efficient, easy ways to get information, and you can set them up for that if you put it in this format on the page. So, think about this. Think about those writing products I asked you to conjure up in your mind, the typical things that you might write in your day-to-day jobs. Where can some of these techniques apply? Where can you be a little bit more upfront with your bottom line? Where can you put information into either a cause and effect or a problem and solution or a sequencing structure? You can all chunk text immediately. You could do it today. Those of you that just wrote one long paragraph, I could have you rewrite that into 3 different paragraphs. And then, of course, you could head each of those different paragraphs. So when you think about these techniques, I want you to put them into your own personal context, because it's going to stick with you a lot better if you think, okay, next time I write an email, I'm just going to put the bottom line up front. Next time I write a newsletter, I'm going to have different chunks for that instead of one big long block of text. Next time when I do chunk that out, I'm going to think about those headers. And the question that I might ask to get them to read that passage, or depending on who your audience is, the statement that I will use that header to be, that they can just read that if that's all they want. So, once you've got these pieces on the page, now it's time to think a little bit about readability, about this idea of readability. How do we make, let's be honest, the relatively dry material that is written in the legislative world, right? You're not writing poetry, you're not writing great novels. These things are not particularly exciting in and of themselves. So what can you do as a writer to make the reading experience a little bit more delightful for that audience that I talked about before? I'm going to talk about 2 different ways that you can connect readability to your text. First, shorten your sentences. Shorten your sentences. This comes from the world of newspapers and magazines. They know their readers to 10 to 15 words max. And there's 2 reasons for that, right? First is bluff. The shorter the sentence, the faster they get to the meat of that sentence, or whatever that sentence is intended to transfer into their brain. But second, remember, these are bad readers very often. They're people that don't like to read. They're people that aren't particularly good at reading. The longer your sentence is, the more they have to restart. Have you ever done this in your own reading, where you're reading something and you kind of like you zone out a little bit and you have to kind of go back? That's what they're doing all the time. And when they get frustrated, they set it down. So here's the tragedy of all the hard work you did, all the research you did, all the thinking you did, all the writing that you created goes out to your audience, and because you didn't follow some of these rules, they set that thing aside and they never read it. And all that work is wasted. All that time and energy has no effect. So shorten your sentences. But once you've got them short, once they're in that 10 to 15 range, no more, now think about rhythm. Variety is the, what do we say? Variety is the spice of life. Thank you, somebody said it. Variety is the spice of life. The human brain wants things to change all the time. We don't want a monotone. You all have those lectures in college or in high school, and it's like, Bueller, anybody seen Ferris Bueller, the teacher that drones on and on and on? You don't want that monotone. Hello, everyone. We're here today to talk about writing. You guys tone out when you hear monotone, so don't make your writing monotone. Vary the lengths of your sentences. I'm going to give you an example of this. And I'm going to start with a monotone. Word sentences are fine, but you might remember this. This is from a few years ago when Kevin Durant used to be on the Warriors. But this was actually in a newspaper, and I was like, that's terrible. They buried the lead. With more than 40 points, 10 rebounds, and 5 assists while hitting 5 3-pointers in Game 3, Kevin Durant became the most versatile player in NBA Finals history. Well, what's the point? Is it the numbers, or is that he became the most versatile player? So flip it around. Because that busy reader I talked about, that reluctant reader who does not want to read, once they get to here, they might go, that's it, great. I don't need to know why. I don't really even care about the numbers. I'm going to accept the claim. And I don't have to slog my way through that. But if I do it this way, you make the reader slog through all that, and they may never get to that main point. So flip that order and use that normal structure of communication with the main point first and then the evidence to support it, the numerical evidence to support it. Third rule. Sometimes when I say this to staff, they faint. I've seen people fall out of their chair. I've heard gasps in the room, so please don't be triggered by this. When it's possible, round your stats off. You can always, this is why people gasp, because they're like, no, I'll get in trouble because I'm not being 100% accurate, right? And I don't want to get in trouble from the member because I'm not being 100% accurate. But you're much, much better off having the member or whoever your audience is in that particular writing product. It's much better if they understand the information. So you can give them that number later. The human brain simply can't process that. $3,976,284.50. It's just too much, too many digits. When you say almost 4 million, people go, okay, I get that. That makes sense. The more specific the number, the harder it is for the brain to grasp it. In fact, don't take it from me. The EU, European Union, when they talk to in their writing manual for their stats people, for their analysts, look what they say. We got this challenge, right? The balance between the readability of the text and the accuracy of the text. And when we fall too much to the accuracy, we put exact numbers in there. But if we think about readability a little bit more, we round numbers off. Because it makes grasping relevant information difficult when we go to specific numbers. But here's the second thing that's really even more fascinating. It actually, when you use an exact number, people actually, you would think they would accept that number versus an approximation, but they actually accept an approximation more. They are suspicious of specific numbers. So if you were having your bathroom remodeled and the contractor came over and he said, it's going to be about $4,000, you'd be like, okay, yeah, about $4,000. If the contractor gave you a bid and he said it's going to be $3,982.15, you'd be like, come on, really? You can figure that out to the 15 cents. We almost reject specific numbers. So don't use specific numbers. Try to find that approximation, that rounding off that gets the idea across quickly. And if they want the real number later, you can do it. Last thing I want to say about numbers is put it into context. Very often, accurate numbers don't make sense to us. We don't really know what it means. Numbers are just kind of confusing to us, which is why good communicators will give a number and then say, that means 1 out of every 4 people will be a victim of whatever kind of crime, or every 16 seconds a car is broken into, or that's the equivalent of 10 football stadiums worth of people. Make the numbers make sense, because accurate numbers don't always mean anything to us. I'll give you an example from my personal life. I travel a lot. I'm here traveling today. And I stay in Marriott hotels very often, so I get the points, so I can every once in a while cash in the points. Every once in a while I'll get an offer from Marriott for a credit card offer. And when they offer you the credit card, that if you get this credit card, you'll get 50,000 Marriott points. And that's an accurate number. It's true. You will get 50,000 Marriott points. But the number means nothing to me. I have no idea what that means. I don't know if that gets me a week at the Four Seasons in Hawaii, or if that gets me one night outside of Cincinnati at a truck stop. I don't know what 50,000 Marriott points get me because it's not in context. Let me give you a real example of this. This is a true statement. An exabyte of data is created on the internet every single day. Every every single day, that much data is produced on the internet. Does that number make sense to anyone in this room? No clue what that number means, right? So I got to put some context on it so that the reader understands what that number means. This is roughly the equivalent of the data in 250 million DVDs. And so now your brain can go, gosh, that's like 10, Amazon distribution centers worth of DVDs every single day on the internet. Of course, it's a young audience here today, so I should probably add a second line of context to say, a DVD was a data storage system that your grandmother used back in the day, because you probably don't even know what a DVD is anymore, so we have to add more context to that particular situation. But the point is, numbers without context don't make sense, and your goal, remember what your function is, to teach, to make them understand. And if you give them accurate numbers that don't make sense to them, then you have failed in your job as a teacher. So those are the 4 rules about making your data more readable. Don't let data become an impediment to your goal. Make it be a part of that goal. So put it in the proper form to enhance, not hinder, the experience of the reader. Make it easy to process. Put the main point up front. And put context around all of your numbers. So, this is the first chunk of our time here today. Form follows function. Quick little wrap up. Remember, you're not writing to the general audience of the world. You're not writing to people who love to read. You're not writing to PhD students. You're writing to a legislative audience. They're super busy, they're task switching, and they don't like to read, and they're not good at reading. So make sure you always put your bottom line up front. You find the right structure for that particular purpose or whatever that information is you're trying to get across. You're going to chunk your text and give them those headers so they can navigate around the house and just get what they want and get the heck out. You're going to think about your sentence length and your rhythm of your sentences for readability, and you're going to always use numbers in a way that gets maximum penetration into their brain, not them sort of shutting down and not being able to process it. So that's the first macro section of our writing workshop today, which is like, how does it work on the page? What's the best way on the page that I can deliver a document to someone, whether it's an email, whether it's a newsletter, whether it's a brief, doesn't matter what the actual document is, you can use all of these techniques to make sure that they're much more likely to connect with, stick with, and then get the benefit from whatever it is that you've written. So now let's shift to the micro. And as we shift to the micro, I'm going to introduce you to another architectural precept, this idea that less is more. It's a bit of a paradox, right? How can less be more? Well, this term comes from an architect, Mies van der Rohe. If you've ever gone to Chicago, there's a lot of Mies van der Rohe buildings. And Mies van der Rohe thought that buildings were too ornate. They were too elegant. There was just a lot of extra stuff on them. And he thought buildings should be stripped down to their absolute bare essential. And when you did less, the building was actually better. It was more. That's the concept that we're going for here. And by the way, we live in a world in which less is more has become more and more popular. You might be familiar with like the tiny house movement. People are selling out their big houses and going into small little houses. Maybe you've heard of Marie Kondo and the art of tidying up, where it's decluttering your house and your life. I don't know if you have this here in Ohio, but in Colorado we have this company called 1-800-GOT-JUNK, and they'll come to your house with a big truck and they'll just take stuff, all the crap out of your house and haul it away. We are in a world in which less is more has become more and more popular. It might want to also be in our writing. So here's a question for you. It's a rhetorical question. What's the function of a staircase? You don't have to say the answer. What's the function of a staircase? It's to move up or to move down, right? So you can do it 2 different ways. Here's one way. Very ornate, very elaborate, very over the top, not very decluttered. Or another way. The leanest, cleanest version of that staircase. The function is being achieved in the smallest form possible. Because remember our goal, remember what our function is to connect with that busy, task-switching, reluctant reader, and we need to strip our writing down to that function only. The simplest, leanest form possible. How many of you in high school had to read Great Gatsby? Hands up, you had to read Great Gatsby. How many of you actually read Great Gatsby? How many of you went to Cliff Notes instead? Or how many there's at least one person willing to admit it. How many of you knew people in your class who went to Cliff Notes? Why do people go to Cliff Notes? What's the advantage of Cliff Notes? It is shorter than the book, right? Instead of it being a whole chapter, I can read a paragraph that summarizes that chapter. I get the same information, in a shorter form. So the ultimate form of writing for your audience is the shortest form it can possibly be. I told you the number 2 killer of readers is density on the page. Words on the page just freak people out. But the biggest, number 1 killer in the literature of reading is length. The longer the thing, the person who doesn't like to read freaks out. Some of you have probably started a book in your life and didn't finish it, because it was just too long. It's like, this thing's like 800 pages. I'm never going to get to the end. I'm going to read a shorter book. Humans tend to go that way. So since you all did read Gatsby, this is a single sentence from Fitzgerald. He was an overwriter, right? That's a single sentence. It's vanished trees, the trees that made way for Gatsby's house and once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. Colon. This is why it's a long sentence. For a transitory enchanted moment, man must have held his brother, it just goes on and on and on. I used to teach Gatsby. I would hand this book out to kids and we'd start to read and I could see their eyes glaze over. I could see the kids almost immediately like, that kid's gonna go to Cliff Notes. That kid's never gonna read this book. That kid's gonna cheat on the quizzes, because it was intimidating to them, the length and the density. Now, Hemingway doesn't get read as much in high schools anymore, but contrast this single sentence from Fitzgerald to this single sentence from Hemingway. Oak Park, the home of broad lawns and narrow minds. He says a lot about the people of Oak Park in a very short amount of words. In fact, quick little tangent here, Hemingway once claimed that he had written the shortest novel ever written. Shortest novel ever written. I'm going to share it with you. You're going to read the shortest novel ever written. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. There's a lot in that sentence, right? There's a lot in that sentence. So this 6-word novel has given rise to a challenge every year. It's called the 6-word memoir challenge. And so the idea, you can go on the internet and do this if you want. You can look back at the totality of your life and try to sum it up in exactly 6 words. Not 5, not 7, exactly 6. Here are some winners from the past years. There's a lot in those 6 words. This one really gets me. I can almost picture like an old couple and one of them has passed, right? And the one that's still alive every morning still makes coffee for 2. There's a lot in those 6 words. So the point here is if you can sum up your life in 6 words, you should be able to sum up a policy brief or something that your member's doing or something that's going on in the legislature or in the community in a lot less than the number of words that you have. So as I said, length is the number 1 killer. Our goal is to get to what Orwell says. If it is possible to cut a word out, a single word, always cut it out. Less is more. Trim the fat. Get it down to the meat and the bones and nothing else, and your reader will have a much better experience with your writing. By the way, why does writing get so wordy? And why does legislative writing in particular get wordy? Because we're trying to sound smart. And we're trying to adopt a formal tone, and when we do that, we just tend to add more words to the page. The other reason that we're wordy in general, or all of you are probably wordier than you need to be, is the fault of people like me, your former English teachers. Here's why. Because instead of saying, write a paper that argues X, we say, write a 5-page paper that argues X. And you might have been able to do it in 2, but you know that the teacher's going to mark you down if it's not 5, so what do? You add a bunch of words in there. How many of you have ever done that in your life? Oh, this is very, 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 very challenging text. Or they'll say it has to be a 500-word essay, right? And maybe you could have done it in 300 words. Orwell says you should have done it in 200 words. Why did the teacher make you do it in 500 words? We are part of the problem, but I'm going to solve that problem for you now. So, I'm about to geek out. I told you I was going to do some English teacher grammar geeking out. Get ready. I'm going to talk about 4 different ways that writing can be instantly shorter. If you have these habits, look for them in your writing, break them in your writing, and you will find that your writing will just naturally get shorter. And you're going to say, well, Kurt, you're talking about cutting 2 words here, or 5 words there, or 3 words here. And does that really matter? And the answer is yes, because over the course of the document, if I can cut 3 words here and 5 words there and 2 words there, suddenly those pennies start to add up to dollars. And a 3-page thing becomes a page and a half. And a 1-page thing becomes a half a page. Or a 2-paragraph thing becomes 1 paragraph, and every time you make it shorter, you increase the likelihood that your audience is going to engage with it, stick with it, and get the message out of it. So let's talk about the first way to do it. These things called nominalizations. And it's just this weird little thing that we do with our brain where we turn the verb of a sentence into a noun. And when we do that, then we have to add another verb into that sentence because every sentence has to have a verb. So when you make the verb into a noun form, like decision instead of decide or growth instead of grow, now we don't have a verb in the sentence. I have to add a verb and all the words around that verb, and suddenly the sentence gets much longer. It also makes them passive, and I'll talk about that at the end here today. So let me give you some examples. Arguments, that's a nominalization because, right, the verb form of that would be to argue. Arguments over small concerns are something most families experience. I have to add experience in here because I've nominalized the verb argue. But if I denominalize it, most families argue over small concerns. Look, 33% of the words just left the page. I went from 9 words to 6 words. And you're like, well, does that really matter? Yeah, it matters sentence after sentence after sentence. Another example. By the way, this is written by an actual legislative staffer. I won't name names here on this camera, but somebody wrote this. The applicability of the legislation exists across several key policy areas because I made applies into a noun. I now have to add the verb and everything else. I have an 11-word sentence. If I denominalize applicability, the legislation applies to several key policy areas. I cut 3 words out. Almost a quarter of the words in that sentence are gone. Sometimes it's so bad that we have these things called nominalized phrases that could have easily been a single word. Look at the last one. Led to the destruction of. 5 words. Could be just destroyed if I turn it into the verb. 5 words becomes 1 word. It's an 80% reduction in that one. Here's how you do it. Here's how you notice it. Whenever you see this construction, a verb and either the word a or and followed by a noun, that's when you have a nominalization. So the report gave an analysis, right? All you do is change that back into the verb form, and suddenly the sentence gets shorter. A couple more examples. The new legislation resulted in a decrease. By the way, this is written by an actual legislative staffer. New legislation resulted in a decrease. There's that construction, right? Verb, a and a noun, result. There's the verb, a, and then the noun form. Change it back into the verb, and we go from 13 words to 9 words. Big, big difference when you add it up over the course of the paper. Last one. The department needs to conduct a review. There's that construction again. Verb, a, noun. All we do is change it back into the verb form. The department needs to review the situation. 30% reduction in words. So nominalizations, simple little thing that just gets in the way. It adds more words, doesn't add any meaning. Doesn't add any extra content, doesn't add any extra analysis, it just adds more words. Okay, second thing we want to talk about are these things called expletive constructions. And what expletive constructions are is the word there or it, and then a to be verb. So it is, it was, there are, there is. For those of you that don't remember what a to be verb is, because it's been a long time since sophomore English, those are the verbs that sort of describe our state of being. Am, was, were, have been, those sort of things. So, it is inevitable that oil prices will rise. Why are we saying it is? Why don't we just get to the point? Oil prices will inevitably rise. First of all, it's not bluff to use expletive construction because you're hiding the meaning, the lead, too late in the sentence. Let's get the meaning right to the beginning. There are likely to be many constituents seeking relief from this proposal. Why am I saying there are? Let's just get to the point, right? Many constituents will likely seek relief from this proposal. That's a 25% reduction in words right there. 8 to 5, 12 to 9 starts to add up. I would argue that expletive constructions are just the empty calories of writing. They don't add anything. There's no new extra meaning that they provide. There's no extra analysis that they provide. There's no insight that they provide. They're just filler words. They are the words that you used in high school when you were like, add it all up on the Microsoft Word and it said it was 250 words, and you're like, crap, it's supposed to be 300. Well, I'm just going to go back through and put a bunch of expletive constructions at the beginning of all my sentences because that'll add up the word count, right? But it doesn't give you any value. There's no nutrients in there. There's no protein. There's no fat. There's no carbs. It's just empty calories. There has been a strong positive reaction to the newly proposed legislation. It's not bluff. You're burying it. The newly proposed legislation was positively received. Half the words simply by cutting out these two. So what happens is when you cut out the expletive construction of 2 words, you tend to reorganize the sentence in a way that it's almost always shorter. So that's the second thing, cut those. Speaking of empty calories, there are these formal, trying to sound smart phrases that we use very consistently in legislative writing that, again, don't add any value to the sentence, don't add any value to the reader, just add more words to the page, which freaks the reader out, which makes them set the writing down, which creates the tragedy of all your work and hard effort being lost. Stuff like this. The reason for. Due to the fact that. In the event that. In a situation where. You can see all these can be replaced with a single word. Gigantic reductions just by getting rid of these overly fluffy, pointless, wordy phrases. Let's take a quick quiz. Large number of. What could you say? Many. Thank you. Despite the fact that. Although, excellent. Each and every. All, or you could say each or every, has the opportunity to. Can or could, at this point in time. Now. Why are we saying at this point in time? It's so long and so formal and so wordy. Good job. You guys all passed the quiz. You are all doing very, very well. All right, last thing I want to talk about. Eliminating passive voice. Many of you might have gotten this from writing instructions in your past, passive voice. George Lucas, the founder of Star Wars, made billions of dollars by creating a character who has two characteristics. One, he's green, and the second is he just talks in passive voice. And we think he's really wise because he talks in passive voice. The problem with passive voice in our writing is that it makes sentences longer. I'm going to talk about another problem that it has in a second. First of all, what is it? All it is an inversion of your sentence, and it's very anti-bluff. Because what it does is it takes the object of the sentence, which should be at the end, and moves it to the front, and takes the subject of the sentence, which should be at the front, and moves it to the back. So let me give you an actual example. Here's active. Kurt, subject, threw, verb, the ball, object. That's active construction. The ball was thrown by Kurt is in the passive. We flipped the sentence around. So we are already hiding the lead. We are burying the lead. Gratuitous Yoda slide for the viewers at home. You get a little extra Yoda slide. Why is it bad? Well, the first reason it's bad is it always uses more words. It's less concise. That's what we're here talking about, is trying to trim out the fat from our writing. Look at this. It is believed by the candidate. That's a passive construction that a ceiling must be placed on the budget by the committee. 18 words. I can say the exact same thing by just moving the subject up to the front. The candidate believes, instead of believed by the candidate, that the committee must place a ceiling on the budget. I cut 5 words simply by moving my subject to the front of the sentence. But it's also bad because it buries the lead. It hides the subject at the back of the sentence. And remember those readers who are getting frustrated by the length of your text or the density of your text and the fact you didn't chunk your text and the fact that you didn't put headers on your text, and they're really getting frustrated with it. This might be the thing that sends your document into the trash pile. Look, a new system of drug control laws was established. Well, by who? I don't even know who the subject of the sentence is. You're not even telling them it's so passive. So how do you spot it? Again, we're back to that to be verb. And then we're going to talk about the past participle, which you probably haven't even thought about or heard that term since you were taking French or Spanish when you were in high school. But all it is the form of the verb with ed on the end. So this is the grammar definition of it, but let's go to something a little bit easier. To be verb plus past participle. When those two things are together, it's always passive. Was eliminated from the budget, has been demonstrated, will be reclassified, were discriminated, is protected. All of those are passive constructions. They're all going to make for longer sentences. So if you don't like the grammar definition of how to spot it, use the zombie rule. If you are reading one of your sentences and you see the verb, and you could add by zombies after your verb, it is passive. Was eliminated by zombies. Has been demonstrated by zombies. Will be reclassified by zombies. If you can put it in there, it's automatically passive. By the way, this is the classic passive voice. Person comes up to the podium, the governor, the president, House Speaker. Mistakes were made. And they do that passive on purpose. Why? What don't they want to say? I made a mistake. You don't want to say that, right? So you say mistakes were made. So sometimes passive voice actually serves a purpose. We do want to hide the subject, but we don't want to do that in our writing. So what do we do to fix it? How do we fix it? Well, the wonderful thing is it's super easy to find and super easy to fix. You look for the word by. Because that word should almost never be in your writing. There's almost nothing that you're going to naturally write with the word by in it unless you're using a passive construction. So all you do is skim and scan your writing for the word by, and I guarantee right after that word is the real subject. And then all you have to do is move that up to the front of the sentence, you reorder the sentence, and the sentence will be clearer, the bottom line will be up front, and it will be shorter. Let me give you an example. One type of air pollution is caused by hydrocarbons. What I say to look for the word by. Once you know what the word by, where it is, what's the next thing? That's the subject of the sentence. So what do? We flip the sentence around. Hydrocarbons cause one type of air pollution. It's only a 2-word reduction. But remember, 2 plus 5 plus 3 plus 1 adds up. Pennies add up to dollars over the course of the document. We're going to do this all together. We're going to say this out loud together as a team. Here's a passive construction, right? Passive voice writing problems were eliminated by zombies. So we know it's passive. By the writing workshop, we look for the word by. We know that this is the subject. We move that up to the front, and we say, the writing workshop eliminated passive voice writing problems. Good job. You guys are all tied for valedictorian of today's class. You all passed both quizzes here at the end. So let's wrap up this micro section here and get to our finish. For the legislative audience, the ultimate form, the biggest thing I can leave you with today is make it shorter, make it shorter, make it shorter, make it shorter. If you walk out of the room and don't learn any other thing today, you onboarding right now, if you don't learn anything else about writing, make it shorter. They will love you for it. They are far more likely to engage with it. They're far more likely to read it. And if we're going to make it shorter, you can't cut content. Let me go back to your writing prompt today. I asked you for 3 skills or attributes, right? Now, some of you might go, well, I know how to make that shorter. I'll just give 2. I can make even shorter. I'll just give 1. But that's sacrificing content. And I asked you for 3. So you've got to give all 3. You've got to make sure that each sentence is as succinct and concise as it can possibly be. And if we can really cut those nominalizations, we get rid of those it is, there are expletive constructions. We don't use those fancy phrases that can be replaced with a single word, those wordy phrases, and we passive voice our writing. If we do those 4 things, I guarantee all of your documents will get shorter and shorter, and your readers will be more and more connected to you. So, we're not going to get to 2 last things because that's for a longer workshop. We're not doing that here today. So, thank you all so much for coming out here today. Thank you at home or in the office or wherever it is that you're watching this, years from now when I'm passed from this earth. Thank you all for coming out today. Thanks for being a part of this demonstration and this videotape. And you guys remember, like I said at the beginning, there was your life before today, and now there's your life after. You are part of history here at the Ohio House. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.